Ukraine's harsh revenge for the monstrous shilling at Kyiv. Putin has surrendered. The nasty little Putin's ready to sign a capitulation on the 1st of November. Insider info from Kirill Budanov, the spirit of Anchorage in the form of Trump, is finishing off the Kremlin cannibal. G'day friends, my name's Vladimir Tymoshenko. Righto, let's have a quick and clear chat about all the most important things. Let's get started. So Putin's terrorists have once again brutally shelled Ukraine. Everything was flying: ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones. At the epicenter of the strike in Kyiv and Dnipro, there are once again deaths, injuries and destruction. Air defence took out 642 enemy targets. However, 30 ballistic missiles did hit their targets. But what's most paradoxical, what's truly striking and maybe even shocking, at the same time as these attacks, there's been heaps of information coming out lately that the war in Ukraine could end this year, the so-called hot phase. And these aren't just some rumours either. Kirill Budanov, just for a second, has confirmed all this. Apparently, Zelensky has actually set this goal: to end the war before the start of winter 2026.
I completely agree. This is the President's directive to try to stop this war. And I can confirm it's his effort to end the fighting as soon as possible, ideally by winter. And as the head of the President's office, I'll do everything I can to achieve the goal set by the President of Ukraine. In my opinion, it's absolutely right, timely and well thought out.
What's more, almost straight after Budanov's statement, a staff member from the President's office even named a possible date for the end of the war on Telegram. The 1st of November is one of the most likely dates for the hot phase of the war to end. It's expected that this will be a freeze along the front line, with security guarantees for Ukraine from Trump. On one hand, it's all pretty clear. Ukraine's leadership reckon they can try to reduce the intensity of fighting before the US congressional elections planned for this year, according to RBC Ukraine. So once again, the supposed date for ending the hot phase of the war is the 1st of November, while the elections in the United States will be held on the 3rd of November. And obviously, Trump really needs the Russia-Ukraine war, which he promised to end in a day, to be over, at least by the time of these elections. Otherwise, Trump and his party could lose out, miss the boat completely, like a sheet of plywood flying over Washington, as they say. Yeah, Trump doesn't really care. He just wants to show off and make it look like he's pulled off another triumphant end to a war. But for us Ukrainians, obviously, the phrase "phrasin' the fightin' doesn't exactly fill us with optimism. But the thing is, Ukraine is playing a pretty delicate diplomatic game right now. Let's try to figure out together exactly what kind of game that is. And we really do have to play it very carefully. You know full well who we're dealing with: Kremlin terrorists who just don't have the ability to use their brains. And that's not an insult, nah. It's actually a direct quote from Putin's minion, Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov. He recently had a bit of a mental coming out, you could say.
Well, sometimes, as they say, I can let myself switch me brain off. Can't you do that too? Why not? I can do it too. It never works anyway. There's no point even trying to turn it on.
Yeah, in the Kremlin, having no brains is becoming mainstream. By the way, we'll definitely come back to this Ushakov bloke later today. But right now, let's talk about why, as things stand, it's pretty hard to believe the war will end this winter. So Putin's come up with a new excuse for why they're killing innocent Ukrainian civilians. He started banging on again about revenge for the strike, supposedly on the teachers' college in Starobilsk. That's in the temporarily occupied part of Luhansk region. And what's telling here is that even the most rabid Z supporters don't really want to talk about the strike on Starobilsk, because even they aren't sure the college was just an ordinary one. We'll get to that very soon, but right now, here's a direct quote from that nasty little Putin.
I didn't just happen to invite both the Prosecutor General and the head of the Investigative Committee. I'd like you to give your assessment of what happened and report on how the work to identify these criminals is going. They all must get the punishment they deserve, and it will be inevitable.
Yeah, right, we get. But let's take a closer look at the strike on Starobilsk. You know the story about the Starobilsk college and dormitory, staged by the Kremlin, is becoming a formal excuse for Putin to keep the war going. That's that classic old KGB move. You know, the Russian propaganda machine is still running, of course, but it's starting to misfire here and there. Here's what the war criminal and enemy of Ukraine, Gherkin Strelkov, has to say about the attack on Starobilsk. I'll remind you, he's now an enemy of Putin as well. It's not all that straightforward over this. The terrorist Gherkin hinted that they were Russian soldiers at the college in Starobilsk, not just innocent students. And now, here's a direct quote from Gherkin Strelkov's letter. Well, it all starts to make sense. Yeah, the college was clearly not for students, but for the military. And just to remind you, according to Russian propaganda, 21 people died there.
19 to 20 years old. Who's that? Is that college age or is that trade school age? No, that's conscription age. That's the age when they were training both drone operators and assemblers.
Exactly. What's more, here's what the official Ukrainian side says. The armed forces of Ukraine strike military infrastructure and facilities used for military purposes, strictly adhering to the norms of international humanitarian law, the laws and customs of war. On the evening of the 22nd of May, after the Russians made statements about the students who'd been killed, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine responded. There, they confirmed a strike on one of the Rubicon headquarters, the Russian Drone Technology Centre in the Starobilsk area. So basically, the pieces of what happened have come together, and Russian propaganda's made a fool of itself again. They didn't manage to spin this story nicely. And the idea, as you've probably gathered from what's been said, was to use Starobilsk to sell the war against Ukraine to patriotic Russians as something sacred. You know, like, we're protecting the kids. And in this way, Putin once again wanted to shore up his position, even if just a little. Because in reality, even the most die-hard Z fans are fed up with the war. They don't like the fact that even Moscow, for example, has actually become a real hotspot. They're not happy that Ukrainian drones are hidden and will keep hitting even harder. And here's where it gets really interesting. You know, the Kremlin in general and Putin personally have a bit of a bipolar streak on top of all these other issues.
To be honest, there are some quite severe and ongoing financial problems currently.
So what do I mean by that? On one hand, the bloke in the bunker is promising unbelievable strikes of retribution and, in fact, keeps hitting peaceful Ukrainian cities, Kyiv, Dnipro and so on. But on the other hand, there's this growing narrative, really picking up steam, that Russia, just like Ukraine, is supposedly ready to end the war. Crikey. In Russia, they've started talking about ending the war in Ukraine to save the economy. While the authorities of the aggressor country, Russia, are trying to come up with a strategy for economic growth as Ukrainian drone attacks hit the economy, Russian businesses are saying the best way out is to end the war in Ukraine. That's according to Reuters. But there's definitely no reason to celebrate just yet. It all sounds pretty unbelievable and kind of cute, but there's a reason I keep saying they're all a bit bipolar over there in the swamps. What do you reckon about that? Russian billionaires are going to chip in 300 billion rubles for the budget. Earlier, Putin called on big business to cough up for the war with Ukraine. The Russian budget has started receiving voluntary transfers from billionaires, according to an expert citing their sources. We're talking about tranches coming from the accounts of subsidiaries of the biggest companies. By the end of the year, they're expecting to receive around 300 billion rubles. So, on the one hand, Russian business says it wants the war in Ukraine to end, but on the other hand, that same Russian business is chipping in for the war against Ukraine. How can you not think of that work-shy drongo?
What?
Oh, nothing. Never mind. Besides, you shouldn't draw any parallels between Zelensky's perfectly understandable wish, which Bodano confirms, to end the war, and the Russian fairy tales about being ready to finish that very same war. Obviously, Zelensky's talking about ending the war on Ukraine's terms, which means Russia's got no chance of getting Donbass or Crimea. But all this Kremlin nonsense is just an attempt to dress up Ukraine's surrender in a pretty package. Even that same Ushakov has come out with a whole lot of weird stuff. Honestly, things that just don't make any sense at all. Like apparently Ukraine ruined everything. Supposedly, Trump and Putin had already sorted it all out back then in Alaska during their face-to-face meeting, but Kyiv just refuses to give in. During the meeting in Alaska, US President Donald Trump and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin reached a mutual understanding on ending Russia's war against Ukraine. But then things started to get complicated. A lot of people use the word agreements. I'd be more precise and say understanding. There was an understanding reached about what each side would do in the context of resolving the Ukrainian conflict, according to the Kremlin official. Ushakov said that the American side promised to fulfill their part of these understandings, but ran into a number of difficulties. Well, let me put it in plain English, not Ushakov speak. The difficulties the Kremlin faced after the Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska were Ukraine's refusal to surrender and the military support from European countries. In short, the Kremlin old-timers are off with the fairies again.
Should we forget Anchorage's spirit and talk about the spirit of Beijing instead?
Well, probably.
What spirit of Anchorage are we even talking about? What spirit of Beijing? Get ready for the spirit of the hate. And by the way, speaking of Anchorage, about that meeting between Putin and Trump in Alaska. You know, enough water has passed under the bridge since the 15th of August 2025, and now we can look at that meeting for what it really was, without all the nonsense from Russian propaganda. And in reality, Anchorage was a complete flop for Putin.
President Putin? Why should President Trump believe what you say?
And it's not even about the bunker dweller pulling those faces. Well, that face at the journalists. It's about something else. Trump clearly wanted to sort out, in his own way, the issue of the war in Ukraine. But little Putin only flew to Alaska back then to spin his usual historical yarns. Yeah, Trump really did put on a show welcoming him, right there at the plane like he was his mate, his bro. But in the end, it all wrapped up with that Kremlin moth's usual patriotic nonsense.
A significant part of the shared history between Russia and the US is linked to Alaska, with many positive events. Even today, there's still a huge cultural legacy from the era of Russian America here.
What, Russian America? What's they all about now? Did Lenin come up with America or something? So is it meant to be Vladimir Ilyich Lenin's America now or what? Anyway, Trump ended up losing it and just straight up kicked Putin out of his country. The work and lunch between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin at the summit in Alaska could have been cancelled since the American side realised there was nothing to be gained from the meeting. Kurt Volker explained that the Russians have a tactic of long monologues at meetings, which probably annoyed Trump as he wasn't able to get any concessions from Putin on the peace issue. By the way, Trump, who's still losing his cool over the war in Ukraine, is nevertheless continuing to show some sort of activity. Trump's team is tied to negotiations over Ukraine, writes the New York Times. US President Donald Trump likes quick military and diplomatic wins, but right now he's hit a dead end on the international stage, the American press reports. By the way, whether Trump's tired or not, that sweet duo Witkoff and Kushner are flying to Ukraine again. But they're in a hurry, you remember? They want to end the war before the 3rd of November, before the US elections. It needs to be wrapped up, and people in the States are sure of it. It does. Otherwise, old man Trump will lose the election.
Witkoff and Jared Kushner are coming to Kyiv. This could happen in as little as 2 weeks, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in an interview with CBS News.
And this bit's important. Zelensky's insistent on it. First, Bieber and Boba, Kushner and Witkoff, have to come to Kyiv. And only after that should they head off to Rashka, to the swamp. Absolutely not the other way around.
The president said that members of the American negotiating team should visit Ukraine in person before heading to Moscow. In his view, this will help them better understand the situation and see the consequences of the war with their own eyes.
But to really understand the level of panic and hysteria happening in the Kremlin right now, at this very moment, just look at this unbelievable story about the Trinity ceasefire, which the Kremlin maniacs suddenly and unexpectedly announced. And of course, it wouldn't be complete without that nutter Yuri Ushakov. He's just everywhere, that bloke. Yuri Ushakov, assistant to the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, claimed that Russia didn't strike Kyiv over the weekend as part of the Trinity ceasefire, according to Mirror Weekly, citing Russian media. The publication quotes Ushakov as saying that Putin proposed a one-day ceasefire for Trinity Sunday, during which he supposedly refused to give the order for a massive missile strike. How funny. And apparently Trump somehow knew about this ceasefire that only existed in Putin's twisted mind. But here's the catch. Ukraine didn't know a thing about this so-called ceasefire. You know why? Because it never actually happened. Let's have another listen to Kirill Budanov.
As for any sort of ceasefire on Trinity Sunday, I haven't received any such information. What's more, you can see for yourself how much damage the Russian Federation caused yesterday and how many people were killed. So I'm not really sure what we're even talking about here.
Yeah, it's not about a ceasefire. The Kremlin old-timers aren't capable of things like that at all. The main question is, why didn't Russia bomb Kyiv on Trinity Sunday, or Kyiv Day for that matter? Let's hear from military and political expert Alexandra Musyenko. So why did Putin's plan to shell Kyiv on Trinity Sunday actually fall through? That mythical ceasefire's got nothing to do with it for sure.
It's more about their ability to carry out strikes and the time they need to get ready. Right now, that's about 10 to 14 days. So that's the time between the last large-scale missile and drone strike and the next one. The time the enemy needs to get ready, stockpile missiles, gather drones, carry out reconnaissance, and track down all those so-called decision-making centres hiding in the bushes, private cooperatives, markets and so on to launch terrorist attacks on residential buildings.
In other words, Russia's fallen apart. They didn't manage to stockpile enough missiles to bomb Kyiv for Trinity Sunday. That's all there is to it. They only just managed it now in the last few days. That's right, but they can't admit they didn't have any missiles. So they came up with this ridiculous story about a non-existent ceasefire. Honestly, they're clowns.
Over the course of a week, over 5 to 7 days, Russia couldn't prepare or carry out large-scale missile and drone strikes. And that means their capabilities aren't increasing. And going forward, when Russia plans its next maximum barrage, it might only be twice a month. That's some mates they can manage.
All right, mates. Now let's sum it all up. Here's the reality. The claim that Russia is supposedly ready to end the war and the parallel information that Ukraine is ready to end the war, well, as they say in Odessa, those are two very different things. Ukraine really does, and it's only logical, want to bring the fighting to an end. That's normal. We don't want our people to die, but the Russian Federation is trying every way possible to achieve. Do you know what? Ukrainian capitulation. And right now, he is betting on using Trump to pressure Ukraine into signing the so-called freeze on the war. Putin has gone all end. He understands that the same land corridor of the Russians to Crimea is already under the fire control of Ukraine. Everyone understands perfectly well where this is all heading. Ukraine will return Crimea home sooner or later. Putin knows full well that in Moscow, air defense missile systems are already being installed on high-rise buildings to shoot down drones. These images have gone around the world, and the entire civilized world has seen them. Now, regarding the clever diplomatic game that, forgive the tautology, Ukraine is playing right now, it's all very simple. Kyiv is showing that, yes, we want to end the war. They're showing Trump that we really are ready. And what is Putin doing at this time? Ukraine is showing that the ball's in Russia's court. And meanwhile, Putin is shelling Ukraine, killing children, women, the elderly, and peaceful Ukrainians in general. And at this moment, it really becomes clear, if you strip away all the fluff, who's actually interested in ending the war and who's just pretending and wants to sign Ukraine's surrender. And now, the most important thing, what will they say in the United States? That's exactly what we'll talk about in our next episodes. For now, subscribe to the UNAN YouTube channel. Everything will be Ukraine. Happily. Bye.